Hello everyone! In this video I'm going to be showing you how I made this Bridgerton inspired dress using my new Mix and Match Regency Dress Pattern, which can be found as a downloadable PDF in my Etsy shop. Now for this dress I'm going to be using the 3-part skirt variation, but I will link below videos to the other skirt variations. Now this dress is inspired by the many presentation gowns that characters like Eloise, Francesca, and Daphne wear. And personally, I love the 3-part skirt the most of all the skirt types in my pattern. And that is because I love the full skirt, the many pleats you can put in the back, and I like that you can make it with or without the train extension. I also think the 3-part skirt is the most historically inspired. So I'm very excited to share the process with you, so let's get into it. Now for materials, I'm going to be using 7 meters of this white crepe back satin, which has embroidered lines of flowers, and it's about 115 centimeters wide. I will also be using a 1/2 meter of plain white cotton for interlining the bodice, and I will also be using a 30 centimeter zipper and some white thread. Next, I'm going to prepare my pattern. First, I need to decide on the bodice, sleeve, and skirt style. For this dress, I have decided on the 2 dart bodice, the puff sleeve, and the 3-part skirt with the train extension. My Mix and Match Regency Dress Pattern does come with different bodice, sleeve, and skirt styles so that you can mix and match the different pattern pieces to create a unique gown. This pattern includes 3 bodice styles, 6 sleeve styles, and 4 different skirts to choose from. But again, for this dress, I have selected the 2 dart bodice, the puffed sleeve, and the 3-part skirt with the train extension. After choosing my pattern pieces, I'm going to print the PDF on the correct paper size, A4. You may need US letter. And I'm going to be sure to make sure my scale is set to 100%. I also like to change my print margins to 0. And here are my 4 PDF patterns printed and ready to be assembled. The 2 dart bodice, puff sleeve, 3-part skirt, and train extension PDFs. First, I check the measurement of the square on the first page of the PDF to make sure the dimensions are correct. Then I begin trimming the page margins as needed and taping the pages together to create a grid. Now every PDF is going to create its own unique grid. For example, my bodice pattern is 8 pages, and the grid it creates is 4 pages across and 2 pages down for the total of 8 pages. And I also put together my puff sleeve pattern, which is 10 pages, and my 3-part skirt pattern is 45 pages. This creates a grid that is 9 pages across and 5 pages down. I also print and assemble my 3-part skirt train extension. This train extension is a separate PDF, and it is 16 pages, which makes a grid that is 4 pages across and 4 pages down. The train extension pieces can be attached to the bottom edge of the skirt side and skirt back. You just have to match the stars printed in gray together and then tape the edges together. This will make the skirt side and skirt back pieces longer so that you have a train. Next, I cut my pattern out to my selected size, which is size 38. This pattern is labeled by the bust size in inches, so take your bust measurement around the fullest part of your bust, your apex, and then you can use this measurement to choose your size. For example, I have a 38 to a 39 inch bust, and I prefer a more fitted bodice, so I chose the size 38. If you're in between sizes or prefer a tighter fitting bodice, then you can test sizing down with a mock-up, which is exactly what I'm going to do next, make a mock-up. Now making a mock-up is super important, and I highly recommend it. If anything, please test a mock-up of the bodice and just test the fit before cutting into any of your expensive dress fabric. Making a mock-up can save you lots of heartbreak and it's also a great chance for you to fine-tune the fit of the garment. For example, you might wish to lower, raise, or shape the neckline. You may wish to adjust the darts, making them a little longer, wider, or more narrow. And you can check the center back for the closure of your choice. For example, you may wish to add extra room if you're using buttons. And you can also compare your body's measurements to the pattern to see if any other adjustments might be needed. For example, measure around your upper arm and compare it to the sleeve. You might also wish to shorten or lengthen the skirt depending on your height. Check all of your measurements and make a note of them and adjust the pattern accordingly. For example, I've decided that I wish to lower the neckline of my bodice. I have lowered the neckline by about 3 centimeters at the center front, while being mindful of the 1 centimeter necessary for seam allowance. I created a mock-up and used marker to draw the lower neckline, and I used my ruler to transfer these measurements to my pattern and then redraw the new neckline. Again, making sure to leave 1 centimeter extra for the seam allowance. And with that, all of my pattern pieces are ready. I have my bodice front with a new lowered neckline, the bodice side, the bodice back, the puff sleeve with sleeve band, the skirt front, the skirt side with the train extension added, and the skirt back with the train extension added. And now I can go ahead and cut my pattern pieces out from my fabric. The first thing I cut out is my bodice pieces from the plain white cotton fabric, which I will use as the interlining layer to help support the bodice. I cut out a bodice front on the fold, 2 bodice sides, and 2 bodice back pieces from this plain white cotton fabric. Next, I cut out my pattern pieces from my satin fabric. And because my fabric has these long stripes of embroidery down the full length of it, I want to be very particular about these stripes and their placement. I opened up my satin fabric to the full width and cut everything in just one layer, one at a time. This was one way to manage the stripe placement. I first cut out my skirt front, being very mindful of those embroidered stripes. I cut one side of my skirt front and then flipped the pattern over to cut the other half. Next, I cut out my skirt side pieces with the train extension, again making sure my stripes are sitting exactly where they need to be. I cut one pattern piece right side up, and then I flipped it over right side down to cut the second skirt piece. Next, I cut out my 2 puff sleeves and sleeve band, again making sure that the sleeves are mirrored. And finally, I cut my skirt back with the train extension, and I cut this using the full width of my fabric. After cutting out my skirt back with the train extension, I cut a small slit into the top edge, the center back, and this small slit was about 12 centimeters long. And again, I just cut this into the center back of my skirt. Instead of creating a center back seam in the back of my skirt, I have instead opted to cut this small slit and finish it with binding, and I'm going to be using this as an opening to get in and out of my dress. The last things I cut out are my satin bodice pieces. This way I could sit at my desk and really fuss over the placement of the embroidery and then cut them out. I eventually cut out 2 bodice fronts on the fold, one for the outer layer and one for the lining. I also cut out 4 bodice sides, 2 for the outer layer and 2 for lining, and 4 bodice backs, 2 for the outer layer and 2 for lining. So just to recap, this is everything I have cut out. 1 bodice front cut on the fold in plain white cotton for interlining, 2 bodice sides in plain white cotton for interlining, 2 bodice backs in plain white cotton for interlining, and 2 bodice fronts cut on the fold from satin. 1 is for interlining and 1 is for the outer layer, 4 bodice sides in satin, 2 for lining and 2 for the outer layer, 4 bodice backs in satin, 2 for lining and 2 for the outer layer. I've also cut 2 sleeves from satin and 2 sleeve bands from satin. And I've cut 1 skirt front cut on the fold in satin, and 2 skirt sides in satin with the train extension, and 1 skirt back in satin, which I've cut on the fold so that it's the entire width of fabric. I've also cut 1 small piece of binding about 26 centimeters long, which I'm going to use to finish the center back slit of my skirt back. Next, I'm going to add the cotton layer of interlining to the back of my bodice outer layer pieces. So basically, I'm going to pin my cotton pieces to the wrong side of my bodice front, side, and back pieces. Now, adding a layer of cotton to the bodice as an interlining layer is totally optional, but I highly recommend it. The cotton can help prevent warping around the neckline and other cut curved edges. It can also give the bodice and the darts some structure and shape, and it can help support heavy skirts and embellishments you may add. I find adding the layer of cotton especially beneficial when working with slippery or lightweight fabrics, especially fabrics like polyester satins. So I just put the cotton layer on the back of my bodice pieces and then I pin it together, and then I can treat these 2 layers as one layer. I highly recommend basting the 2 layers together and then you begin sewing. Basting the outer layer to the cotton will prevent shifting as you work on the garment, and it's going to make treating the 2 layers as one layer a little bit easier. I started off by just pinning the 2 layers together, and then later on I basted them, but just go ahead and baste them together right now. Definitely don't be lazy like I am. I've also used pencil to draw the bodice darts onto my cotton interlining layer. You of course could use chalk to draw your darts. Next, I pinned the darts into my bodice front and basted them in place. I matched the legs of the dart together, folding the dart in half and then pinning it to secure. And I baste the darts by hand, and I find that basting the darts before machine stitching helps keep the 2 layers of fabric in place, and it makes sewing the darts much easier when you finally go to the machine. After basting, I then use my machine to sew the darts into the bodice, and I start from the bottom and stitch upwards, tapering off the bodice as I sew. You can then tie the thread ends to secure. Next, I match my bodice side to my bodice front along the straight edges, with right sides facing one another, and I pin. Then I stitch those side edges. First, I stitch with a straight stitch. Then I trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And here you can finally see me basting my bodice pieces to the interlining. Next, I attach my bodice back to my bodice side, and I match the curved edges together with right sides facing one another, and then I pin. After pinning, I stitch with 1 centimeter of seam allowance and then trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. Now when pinning and sewing these curved edges, please work slowly. These can be a little tricky to match together, so sometimes they need a little extra fussing to get it right. And stitching these curved edges can be just as tedious as pinning, so again, just work very slowly as you pin and then stitch these curved edges. After stitching, you can trim the seam allowance and then finish it with a zigzag stitch. After attaching my bodice back to my bodice side, I like to give the full bodice a good press with an iron. I like to press all of my seams and darts towards the back. Next, I match the shoulder strap edges together with right sides facing one another. I pin the bodice front to the bodice back at the top shoulder edges and then I stitch. After stitching, I trim the seam allowance and finish with a zigzag stitch. And then you can repeat all of the previous steps to create the bodice lining. Use chalk to draw in the bodice darts on the wrong side. Baste and stitch the darts in place. Stitch the bodice front to the bodice side. Stitch the bodice side to the bodice back, and then stitch the top shoulder edges of the bodice front to the bodice back together. I also like to finish all of the raw edges of my bodice lining with a zigzag stitch. And then you should have one complete bodice for the outside layer and one for the lining. You can also see the subtle difference adding the cotton layer. Next, let's make the sleeves. Now I'm going to do something a little extra for my sleeves. After cutting out all of the pattern pieces for my dress, I had some scraps left over, and I just hated the idea of wasting some of the pretty embroidery. So what I'm going to do is make some rectangles, some bands, and then attach them to my sleeve for a little extra embellishment. So what I'm going to do is cut out 12 rectangles from my scrap fabric. Each rectangle is about 7 by 25.5 centimeters, and I cut out 6 for the front and 6 for the back. Next, I match the fronts to the backs with right sides together and then stitch along the sides. After stitching, I trim the seam allowance and then turn them right side out. This is going to make 6 little tubes. Next, I press the tubes with an iron, get them nice and flat, and then I add a little top stitching to the sides to secure. Now I have 6 little ribbon-like bands, which I'm going to pin to the sleeve. These bands are just a little bit longer than the sleeve, and I pin them so that they puff out a little bit. After pinning, I stitch them down to the top and bottom of the sleeve to secure. Now these little bands are totally optional. They're just a fun decorative element that I added so that I could utilize every inch of embroidery on my fabric. But it's totally optional and you don't have to do it. And once I have those bands attached to my sleeve, I can get back to the usual sleeve construction. If you don't want to add these little decorative bands, then you can just skip it and come right here and start making your sleeve. Now for sleeve construction, the first thing I do is add 2 lines of gathering stitches. I set the machine to the longest length straight stitch and I add 1 line of gathering stitches to the top edge, the head of the sleeve, and 1 line of gathering stitches to the bottom edge of the sleeve. I will use these gathering lines of stitches to gather down the sleeve. I do this by pulling on the threads of the gathering stitches along the bottom edge, and then I gather down that bottom edge so it is the same length as the sleeve band. Once the bottom edge has been gathered down so it is the same length as the sleeve band, I then pin the sleeve band to the bottom edge of the sleeve. I want the right side of the sleeve band facing the wrong side of the sleeve, and I pin these bottom edges together. After pinning the sleeve band to the sleeve, I then stitch along the bottom edge. And as I stitch, I am taking care as I sew over top the gathers. I also finish this bottom edge with a zigzag stitch. Next, I'm going to fold the sleeve band up 2 times and pin it down over top the previous line of stitching and gathers. The first fold is to hide the raw edge of the sleeve band, and the second fold is to create a nice finished edge. I pin the folded edge over top the previous stitching, just covering it a bit, and then I stitch it down in place. This creates a nice finished bottom edge to the sleeve. As you're stitching the sleeve band in place, take care to sew very closely to the folded edge and make sure the gathers are hidden neatly underneath. Also, make sure not to twist or warp the sleeve band when folding it and pinning it. You can also give your sleeve band a nice press with the iron so it's nice and flat and smooth. And then you can repeat these steps for your other sleeve. Add 2 lines of gathering stitches to the sleeve head and the bottom edge. Gather down the bottom edge of your sleeve so that it's the same length as your sleeve band. Match the sleeve band to the bottom edge of the sleeve, the right side of the sleeve band facing the wrong side of the sleeve, and then stitch them together. And then fold the sleeve band up twice, once to hide the raw edge and a second time to create the finished bottom edge, and then top stitch down close to the folded edge. And this is how your 2 sleeves should look once completed. Now you can fold the sleeve in half, right sides facing each other, and match the side edges of the sleeve together. I then pin these side edges together, stitch, and then trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Next, we can attach the sleeves to the bodice. I am going to set the sleeve into the bodice with the right side of my sleeve facing the right side of my bodice and pin these right sides together. I'm going to start by matching the side seam of my bodice to the side seam of my sleeve and pin. And then working up either side of the sleeve, I'm going to pin the sleeve flat and smooth into the armhole of the bodice. I will be matching and pinning as I work up either side of the armhole from that side seam up towards the top shoulder area. From where your shoulder strap seam is to over the top of the shoulder is where you're going to gather down the remaining volume of the sleeve head. You will just pull the threads of the gathering line of stitches that you added earlier, and you're going to gather down the top edge of the sleeve head so that it fits into the armhole. I like to focus my gathers to the very top of my shoulder. So I just gather down the sleeve head and massage the gathers into place and then pin the sleeve head into the armhole. Again, I just focus my gathers to the very top of my shoulder, somewhere between a 10 and 15 centimeter space. Once the sleeve is set into the armhole of the bodice, it should look like this. You can see how the bottom armpit area of the sleeve is smooth, and the top shoulder area is where all the gathers are. And I just repeat these steps for my other sleeve, starting by matching the side seam of my bodice to the side seam of my sleeve with right sides touching. Then I pin and continue pinning up either side of the armhole, keeping the sleeve smooth and flush when set into the bodice. At the top shoulder area, I gather down the remaining volume of the sleeve head so that it fits into the armhole, and I pin it in place. Pull the threads on the gathering line of stitches at the sleeve head and massage the gathers into place. Then the entire sleeve should be set into the bodice. The lower armpit area should be set smoothly into the armhole, and the top shoulder area is where all the gathers are focused. I also like to give both sleeves a quick check with a ruler to make sure that my gathers are the same length and everything is looking symmetrical. Next, I take the sleeve to the machine and I stitch it into place. As I stitch, I take care when sewing over top the gathers, and I stitch around the entire armhole, securing the sleeve to the bodice. After stitching, I trim the seam allowance and then I finish that raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And here you can see how the sleeve looks once it has been set into the bodice. You can see the gathers all at the shoulder area and the inside of the garment. You can also see how the sleeve looks with the little bands that I added for a fun decorative element. And now that the bodice is finished, I'm going to set it aside and start working on the skirt. To begin, I'm going to be adding binding to the raw edges of the slit that I cut into the center back of my skirt back piece. Since I have cut my skirt back as one full width of fabric instead of cutting two separate skirt pieces, there is no longer a center back seam. So instead of creating a center back seam, I instead opted to cut a slit that is about 12 centimeters long into the center back of my skirt. This is going to create an opening so that I can get in and out of my dress. Now I'm going to finish the edge with a piece of binding, a narrow rectangle that is about 3 by 26 centimeters. And with the right side facing the wrong side of my skirt back piece, I stitch it to the slit. Then I carefully fold the binding over 2 times, once to hide the raw edge and a second time to create a finished bound edge, and then I top stitch it down in place. I kind of use this binding like bias tape, and the process is similar to how I finished the bottom edge of my sleeve. Now this method is totally optional and admittedly a little more fussy. You may prefer instead to have 2 skirt back pieces and have a center back seam. This is much easier. If you do opt instead to have 2 skirt back pieces, then you can leave the center back seam unsewn and return to sew it up when you add your zipper or back closure later on. And here you can see it finished, how that center back slit looks once it's been finished with binding. And now I can continue on sewing my skirt pieces together. First, I match my skirt side to my skirt back with right sides together, and I pin and then stitch. I then trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And I repeat this for the other side, matching the other skirt side piece to the skirt back. And I take care here to make sure that the correct sides are matched together. I want the bottom edge of the skirt side to taper down into the train for a rounded shape. And if you don't want to finish with a zigzag stitch, you could of course always create a French seam or finish these edges with a different method of your choosing. And here's how the skirt is looking so far, with the 2 skirt side pieces joined to either side of my skirt back piece. You can also see how these skirt side pieces taper down into the skirt back, creating this long rounded train. Next, I match my skirt side edges to my skirt front edges. I pin the sides together, stitch, and then trim the seam allowance and finish with a zigzag stitch. And now my skirt is kind of looking like a big tube with all of the sides sewn together, and it is ready to be attached to the bodice. I'm going to match the top waist edge of my skirt to the bottom waist edge of my bodice, and I'm going to match these waist edges together with right sides touching. I will start by finding the center front of my skirt and bodice and match these 2 points together and pin. For my dress, I am matching the center front stripe of embroidery, but you can use chalk or a pin to measure and then mark your center front points. Match the center front points together and pin, and then working down either side of the dress, match the skirt to the bodice and pin these edges together, keeping everything smooth and flush. And work from the center front towards the back of your dress, again keeping everything smooth and even. Once you reach the back of your bodice, you will gather or pleat down the remaining waist edge of the skirt so that it fits onto the bodice. Basically, the skirt's waist edge is much longer than the bodice's waist edge, so that remaining waist edge must be pleated or gathered down to fit onto the bodice. It's up to you if you prefer pleats or gathers at the back of your dress. You can also decide if you want to start your pleats or gathers at the side seam of your bodice, or instead concentrate all of that volume to the very back of your bodice. There is flexibility in how you arrange the back of your dress. Much of this will be up to your taste and preference. For my dress, I'm going to create 4 stacked pleats on either side and focused the pleats at the very back of the dress. I arranged my pleats by hand and then pinned them in place. And this part can take a little fine-tuning. I often repleat 2 or 3 times before I'm satisfied. And once my skirt has been pinned to my bodice all along that waist edge, then I take it to the machine and stitch the waist edges together, sewing the skirt to the bodice. I stitch and then finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And here's how the dress is looking so far. I've left 1 centimeter for seam allowance on the bodice's center back edge because that's where I'm going to be sewing my lining later. Now I can add the lining to my bodice. I start by matching the 2 bodices together, starting at their center front points and making sure that right sides are together. I pin the center fronts together and then match and pin all the key points together, like the center back edges and the shoulder seams. And I pin the lining to the bodice all around the neckline and the center back edge. Next, I stitch my lining to my bodice, sewing around the entire neckline and the center back edges. After sewing my lining to my bodice, I then clip the seam allowance and clip the corners to make turning right side out easier. As I'm clipping the seam allowance, I take care not to cut too far or past the line of stitching. Then I can turn the bodice right side out and press the neckline with an iron so it has a nice crisp finish. Next, I fold the seam allowance of my lining inwards and pin it down. I pin along the waistline on the inside of my dress as well as the armholes. Then I can stitch by hand the lining to the seam allowance of my bodice. By turning the edges of my lining inwards and stitching it to the seam allowance of my bodice's outer layer, I can create a very tidy finished inside to my garment. Now this can be a bit time consuming, but it makes for a very lovely finished result. I also decided at this point I wanted to pin my zipper into the back of my dress and stitch it in by hand. I think because my dress does not have a typical center back seam, I wanted to sew my zipper in by hand so that I had a little more control over it. You could opt to sew the zipper in place before adding your lining. This will create a much prettier finished look with the zipper partially hidden under the lining. You could also choose to machine stitch the zipper in place instead of hand sewing like I am. You could also go for a totally different back closure, like adding buttons, hooks and eyes, ribbon ties, or eyelets for a corset style back. This is all totally up to you. I just recommend you test it out with a mock-up. So yeah, I sew my zipper in by hand into the center back of my dress, and then I continue sewing my lining to my bodice's outer layer's seam allowance. And I find that the armholes are especially tricky, so I often place my dress inside out on my mannequin and then pin the lining in place before hand sewing it. Here's what the dress looks like. Again, adding the lining can take a bit of time, but I think it makes for a very nice finished look. And of course, you could always opt instead to add a facing or just finish the neckline with binding. And now the dress is almost complete. It's really a great time to try it on and see if you want to trim the skirt. I recommend checking the length of your skirt before cutting your pattern pieces out from your fabric, but now is a good time to give the length a double check before hemming. So if needed, trim the bottom edge of your skirt and then you can hem the bottom edge. I recommend a narrow rolled hem, but for my dress, I'm going to be finishing the bottom edge with binding. I have some scraps of fabric left over, and I'm going to use them to make some binding, and then I'm going to add the binding around the entire bottom edge of my dress. I start by sewing my strips of binding together at an angle, then I trim the seam allowance and press it flat with an iron. Then I sew this super long piece of binding around the entire bottom edge of my dress, with the right side of the binding facing the wrong side of my skirt. Then I fold it over 2 times towards the right side of my skirt and pin it in place and top stitch it down. This process is very similar to how I added the sleeve band to the bottom edge of my sleeves, and how I finished that slit I cut into the center back of my dress with binding. And I think this makes a very nice finished edge to the bottom of my dress, and it's a very nice alternative to the simple rolled hem. But of course, you could just do a rolled hem instead to finish the bottom edge of your dress. And with that, my dress is finished. Now I'm so excited to share the finished dress with you. I was also lucky enough to be able to take this dress to Bath for photos, which is where some of Bridgerton is filmed. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see other fun DIY videos or other videos where I make Bridgerton inspired dresses, then definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.